This is a lifesaver. Little quick tip here. If you forgot one of those, that's the way to do it. Welcome to the Underwater Filming Tips series. My name is Vanessa Cara-Kerr and this is episode number 4. In this episode, we're going to be talking about aperture. Like shutter speed, the aperture will affect the brightness and the look of your image. If you didn't see the episode on shutter speed, just go and check it out up here. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell button to be notified when we upload future episodes. Let's dive right into it. What is the so-called aperture? Like shutter speed and ISO, the aperture affects the brightness of your image. But the important part here is it doesn't only affect the brightness of your image, it also affects the look of your image. So what do I mean by look? Well, by look I mean the depth of field. Depth of field is essentially the area in your image that is sharp and in focus. Anything in front or behind that area will be out of focus, it will be blurred out. And there's two different terms for depth of field. There's a shallow depth of field and there's a deeper depth of field. A shallow depth of field means the area that is in focus, that is sharp, is very small. And a deeper depth of field means you have an overall bigger area in the image that is sharper. So having a shallow depth of field means you're going to have a tight area that is in focus and the rest in front and the rest behind is going to be out of focus. This technique is used very often for portrait photography, for macro photography, for product photography, where you just want to have the viewer's attention focused to one little area. So anything in front and behind the subject will be out of focus and you can sort of eliminate the background and the foreground. On the contrary, a deeper depth of field means that you're going to have an overall sharper image from front to back. So this is used very common in landscape photography when you want to have the whole landscape in focus. But this is just a rough explanation of depth of field. Technically, it's not 100% correct, but for now, that's enough and that's all you need to know. There's a lot more to depth of field than aperture. For instance, the distance to your subject, the focal length of your lens. But we're going to save all of that for an in-depth video on depth of field. So let's get back to aperture. Once you understood how aperture works and what it affects and how the look changes in your image, you can use it above water, underwater. Essentially, anytime you have a camera in your hand, it will work and affect the image in the same way. And like with shutter speed, you have a dedicated dial on the camera to change the aperture. And be sure to set the camera to manual mode, especially for filmmaking, to be able to change the aperture that you desire. And with photography, you can set the camera to AV mode. This means aperture priority mode. You set the aperture that you want, and then the camera will choose the according shutter speed to get the perfect exposure. And the aperture priority mode should only be used in photography. Because for filmmaking, you want to use the 180 degrees shutter angle rule. That means you always want to have the shutter speed double your frame rate and you don't want to have the camera setting the shutter speed for you. There are some situations in which case you might change to AV mode when you're filming. These are special situations and it doesn't always work. Besides the aperture priority mode, the AV mode, you also have the TV mode, the time value mode. In this case, you will set the desired shutter speed and the camera will choose the according aperture for you to expose the image properly. Now, then you don't have any control over the depth of field of your image. When you're filming underwater, try to stick to full manual mode so you can learn how all the settings affect your image, and this is going to give you the best results. So how does the aperture affect the brightness of the image and the depth of field of the image? When you change the aperture value on your camera, it actually mechanically changes the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is a multi-bladed iris that opens and closes depending on how you set your aperture value. The blades of the diaphragm open and close, letting more or less light through the aperture. So the aperture is actually the diameter of the hole that is created by this multi-bladed iris. The aperture is like the pupil of your eye, the black part of your eye, and the iris is the diaphragm, the colorful part of your eye, and that expands and compresses the black part, the aperture, your so-called pupil. In order to change the aperture, you have to change the f-stop number with the dial on your camera. And just for your information, the F of f-stop stands for focal length of your lens, and stop means it stops the light from hitting the sensor. We're going to keep it very basic and simple for you in this video. We're not going to dive too deep into focal length of your lenses. The only thing you need to know is the following. To change the aperture, you have to change the f-stop number, the f-stop value. A low f-stop number like 1.4 or 2.8 means the iris blades are wide open, letting a lot of light coming through. This is referred to as a wide open aperture. And a very high f-stop number like f11 means the iris blades are closed down more, letting less light through. This is referred to as a closed aperture. So just remember, with an increasing f-stop number, the amount of light hitting the camera sensor decreases and vice versa. It sounds complicated, but after a while you won't even think about it anymore. And it's very helpful to remember the primary f-stop scale. So you only need to know two things, f1 and f1.4. Once you know these two numbers, you can do the math and remember the f-stop scale. So it's very easy. For the first two numbers, f1 and f1.4, you just have to double the first two numbers. So f1 times 2 is 2. And then you have f1.4 times 2, that's f2.8. And then you just go further on from there. f2 times 2 is f4, f2.8 times 2 is f5.6. So then you have f8, f11, f16, f22, and so on. And of course, 2 times 5.6 is not f11. That's going to go too much into the mathematical details and square roots and everything. For now, just memorize the primary f-stop scale and you will be fine. And just on a side note, cameras go in third stops, not in full stops. So they don't go from 1 to 1.4. They will go from 1 to 1.1, 1.2, and then go to 1.4. And the most important part is every stop of light on the primary scale is one stop of light. That means the light is cut in half. So going from 2.8 to f4, you're blocking half the amount of light. So 2.8 is double as bright as f4. So f2.8 is 4 times brighter than f5.6. And then 2.8 is 8 times as bright as f8, and so on and so forth. And another important part is on your lens, you'll find the f-stop, the aperture value of your lens. So there are two main differences on your lens. You have lenses that have a constant aperture, a fixed aperture, and a variable aperture. A prime lens, for example, only has a constant aperture. Prime lenses are lenses that only have one focal length. For example, 8mm, 17.5 millimeters, 45 millimeters. So these are lenses that cannot zoom. They have a fixed focal length. But some lower end zoom lenses and kit lenses have a variable aperture. So I'll try to explain this quick and simple for you. If you have a zoom lens with a fixed aperture of 2.8, then you have the aperture setting at 2.8 throughout the whole zoom range. So if it's set to 12 millimeters at its widest angle, you have f2.8. That will be the widest open aperture that this lens can do. And if you zoom in all the way to 35 millimeters, then the widest open aperture will be 2.8 as well. And with the cheaper kit lenses, when you zoom in, the aperture will change. You will not have a constant aperture. So if this were a kit lens, you would have 2.8 widest open aperture at the focal length of 12 millimeters, so as wide as it can get. And then when you zoom in all the way, the aperture will change from 2.8 to 5.6. So when it's zoomed in at 35 millimeters all the way, you will have the widest open aperture of 5.6. That means you will have, as we learned, 4 times less light than at 2.8. So you won't have that nice shallow depth of field. And you want to have that shallow depth of field if you want to separate your subject from the fore or from the background. So when you're filming interviews, for example, or you're filming underwater and you're filming a fish and you want to eliminate the background and just have all the attention on that fish or whatever marine creature you have, then you can only do that with a zoom lens that has a constant aperture throughout the whole zoom range. But of course, if you have a constant aperture throughout the whole zoom range, like with this lens 2.8, it doesn't mean you cannot stop down. You cannot change the f-stop. Of course, you can change the f-stop value. If you're zoomed in, you don't need to have 2.8. You can choose f8, f11, or whatever you want. But the important part here is that if you zoom in all the way, you can have the 2.8. So the constant aperture only refers to the widest open possible aperture throughout the zoom range. Zoom lenses with a variable aperture are cheaper because they don't have the possibility to have that constant aperture throughout the whole zoom range. So if you want to check if your zoom lens is a variable or a constant aperture, just check the f-stop number written on your lens. If the lens only shows one f-stop number, then you're the lucky one, you have an aperture throughout the whole zoom range. And if you have like f2.8 to f5.6, then you'll have a variable zoom lens, so that would be a lower quality lens. I know it's a lot, but bear with me, it's worth understanding all of these things. It's going to improve your underwater filmmaking and photography so much more. So let's get back to it. As we learned, the depth of field is the amount of sharpness in your image. So the little issue with that is, if you have a low f-stop number, so wide open aperture, the focusing plane reduces. So it's going to be increasingly more difficult to nail that focus, because on the display of your camera it may seem like it's in focus, but actually when you look at it at the computer, you maybe be off a little bit, and then not the eyes of your subject are in focus, but the ears of your subject is in focus. So here are just a few tips that can help you nail the focus. The first thing you can do is you can use focus peaking. Most of the cameras these days offer focus peaking. So focus peaking will highlight all the areas in your image or on your subject that are in focus. With focus peaking, you have to set the color to what works best for you. So you're gonna have to do some trial and error underwater to see what colors you can actually see best underwater. The focus peaking is only used with manual focus. And if you're using an underwater monitor, usually they have the focus peaking as well. If you didn't buy an underwater monitor yet, well, keep that in mind, because that's maybe an important tool for you to nail the focus underwater. Another helpful tool is the magnification option of your LCD screen or your monitor. You can punch in, set your focus manually, punch out, and then you hit record. And some cameras and external monitors even allow that during the recording process. So you can double check if your focus is still correct. So finally, how does the f-stop affect the look of your image? So in the examples I'm going to show you, I will be compensating the aperture with the ISO to keep the proper exposure. Because as we learned, the aperture doesn't only affect the depth of field of the image, but also the brightness of the image. To sum it up, think before you shoot in what aperture you want to shoot, what creative choices you want to make for your image, how you want to use the aperture creatively. Do you want to have a shallow depth of field? Do you want to have just a little part of your image in focus, or you want to have the whole image in focus? If you're shooting underwater landscapes or underwater sceneries with a wide angle, you're going to have a higher f-stop number because you want to have the whole reef or the whole underwater scenery in focus. For example, if you're shooting a wreck, then you would choose a higher f-stop number as well, because you want to have the whole wreck in focus and not just the tip of the wreck. But be aware, don't close the aperture down all the way, because usually there's a sweet spot with the lenses. So depending on the quality of your lens, an f22 might not be as sharp as f8, because the sharpness quality is usually best around the middle range of the lenses. But you can check the best aperture settings for your lens online and see in what f-stop number the lens performs best and is sharpest. And as mentioned, opening and closing the aperture will let less or more light in, so you're gonna have to compensate that either with your ISO or with your shutter speed or with light. I hope you liked this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and if you have any questions, just leave a comment below. Safe diving, and I will hopefully see you in the next episode.